That is incredible. There are so much threats to the net users. Nandita ma'am, are there any more?
Well, you should also be aware of the additional threats to the network.
Additional threats? What could they be, ma'am?
Besides all the viruses and spyware, there are some additional threats. Let me tell you. Let's start with SQL. The full form of SQL, often pronounced as SQL, is Structured Query Language. SQL accesses and lets you manipulate databases. As the technology grew, the websites also started becoming more technologically advanced as well as dynamic in nature. This dynamism generated need to store input of the user and content of the site in databases. A program to do the same was needed, and SQL was developed and added to almost every popular scripting language. But it also became vulnerability, as it allowed an attacker to inject malicious input into an SQL statement. A very simple example of a metro train running between 4 stations A, B, C and D can be studied to understand this phenomenon a little better. The train has been programmed to halt at stations only if some passenger were waiting at the platform. Otherwise, it does not halt there. The train keeps on moving to the next station and so on and so forth. If someone with malicious intent changes this programming statement and instructs the metro train to ignore passengers waiting at the middle 2 B and C stations and halt at the end in D station only, it will create a big jam and the whole metro train system is likely to come to a grinding halt until the right program or the process becomes effective. Same thing happens when SQL injection is used. It changes the program by giving invalid inputs, and as a result, the site gets compromised. Same thing happens when SQL injection is used. It changes the program by giving invalid inputs, and as a result, the site gets compromised. Technically speaking, fundamentally, an input validation error is what the SQL injection is all about. These vulnerabilities surface when an application which interacts with a database and in an unsafe manner allows passage of data to an SQL query, as we saw in the case of Metro above. Remember, when the data is mistaken as instructions, the SQL injection attack impact can include leakage of sensitive data to the public, the destruction of the entire database or website defacement. SQL injections has been rated as the #1 most dangerous security vulnerability out of all the types of security intrusions and has almost constantly and consistently remained amongst the top vulnerabilities for a long period. There have been instances when millions of web pages were affected by SQL injections in just 1 month, and there was economic disruption too as a result. More recently, SQL injection attack was reported to have been used in high-profile attacks against organizations such as Sony Pictures. SQL impact on business sites can be very far-reaching. A successful attack may result in the unauthorized viewing of user lists, the deletion of entire tables, and, in certain cases, the attacker gaining administrative rights to a database, all of which are highly detrimental to a business. When calculating the potential cost of an SQLI, it is important to consider the loss of customer trust should personal information such as phone numbers, addresses, and credit card details are stolen. While this vector can be used to attack any SQL database, websites are the most frequent targets.
Are there any measures that user can undertake to prevent SQL injection attacks?
It is mostly the designers of website who do something to prevent these attacks. However, the most important thing for the user is the awareness of it. User should ensure that he updates his systems regularly. The user should always patch his systems to prevent him from becoming the medium through which these attacks could be launched. The next is buffer overflow.
What is this buffer overflow, ma'am?
To understand the concept of buffer overflow, let us take the example of a cup of tea. When you pour more tea in this cup beyond its capacity, tea will overflow and spread over to the nearby area. In the same manner, if the storage area of the system has a fixed code length capacity and some code tries to force more data, it is but natural that program will overflow the boundaries and it will overwrite itself in the memory in immediate nearby locations. This phenomenon is called the buffer overflow.
How does this phenomenon can harm our systems, Nandita ma'am?
The potential threat of buffer overflow can be explained as overwriting of the memory of the system, which can result in corrupting the data or crashing the system. The buffer overflow may result into not only overwriting adjacent memory location, but also it could corrupt the data or crash the program, or might even cause the malicious code to execute programs just inside your system, which can steal your data saved in your system.
Just how this treat originated, ma'am?
Well, for that, you need to know the factual origin of the threat. As a matter of fact, the credit to push cybersecurity to the forefront of the computer professionals goes to a buffer overflow in Unix program that allowed a cyber expert to create a worm which infected 10% of the internet in just 2 days in the late 1980s.
Oh, it all started back then?
Yes, Rajesh, this was not a very new thing. The risk factor is bad programming practices.
Bad programming practices that leave open vulnerabilities are responsible for buffer overflow. In some programming languages, there are many manipulative functions of memory in which there are no checks that the number of bytes which are being written or read would fit in the buffer. The result is that the buffer meant for it gets quickly overwritten. It is often common for the developers of web applications to not allocate buffers that are large enough or check for the overflow issues. Attackers misuse this vulnerability to sometimes get control of the administrative rights of your computer system too. In reality, a buffer overflow exploit, the attacker sends data to a program. which it stores in an undersized stack buffer. The result is that information on the call stack is overwritten, including the function's return pointer. The data sets the value of the return pointer so that when the function returns, it transfers control to malicious code contained in the attacker's data. Although this type of stack buffer overflow is still common on some platforms and in some development communities, there are a variety of other types of buffer overflow, including heap buffer overflow and off-by-one error, among others. Another very similar class of flaws is known as format string attack. There are a number of excellent books that provide detailed information on how buffer overflow attacks work, including building secure software, writing secure code, and the shell coder's handbook. At the code level, buffer overflow vulnerabilities usually involve the violation of a programmer's assumptions. Many memory manipulation functions in C and C++ do not perform bounds checking and can easily overwrite the allocated bounds of the buffers they operate upon. Even bounded functions can cause vulnerabilities when used incorrectly. The combination of memory manipulation and mistaken assumptions about the size or makeup of a piece of data is the root cause of most buffer overflows.
Are there any example of malwares which creates buffer overflow, Nandita ma'am?
Yes, there are examples, Rajesh.